In wills and probate work, accuracy matters, and time is of the essence. Designed for UK private client law firms, Leap's all-in-one legal software automates wills, probate and estate administration, supporting compliance and growth without increasing overheads. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Listeners to the podcast are aware that the objective behind the podcast is to introduce you to people and organisations who contribute to the success of the wills and probate sector. And this is very true in the case of my guest today, Anthony Phillips, CEO of Arken.legal. Arken, very well known in the sector, but with the greatest of respect to you, Anthony, probably less well known, having recently taken up the role as CEO. So thanks so much for joining the podcast.
David, thank you, and a pleasure to be here.
I made a joke when we first met. Your predecessor spent many, many years convincing people that he wasn't Australian because he was from New Zealand. There's a great irony here because you are in fact from Australia.
Yes, unabashed, but I have a foot in each camp. I was actually born here, so I can mourn as well as celebrate the ashes, depending on the scenario.
Well, that took us 30 seconds to bring up. Well, let's start with a little bit about yourself, Anthony, your background and what has brought you to Arken in recent months.
Thank you, David. Well, I actually started my career as a lawyer, not in this space, but I trained as a lawyer and practiced for several years, but corporate commercial, IP, telecommunications, that kind of area. And spent most of my career as a technologist, working for technology firms, Microsoft, Meta, some of the better known, but then also a startup. And I love innovation. I like being on the bleeding edge. So my career as a lawyer was sort of, in those days, internet law, which was new, and then sort of the bleeding edge of intellectual property. Then the mobile space, when mobile devices were innovating quickly, not as quickly as they might have at Microsoft, sadly, and Meta with virtual reality and augmented reality. So really kind of bleeding edge or innovation where there's sort of an opportunity to literally develop a business, but on the business side, not the technology side, but with a focus obviously on the technology. And somewhat out of left field, the thing that just really curled my socks on this opportunity was it's a marriage of law and technology. And I really enjoy the law. I like working with lawyers. I like the rigor. There's a lot that I really enjoyed about it. And the marriage of technology. And, technology is just fascinating and always changing and always new and always interesting. So it's a really great marriage, those two things, but at a particularly interesting time. So with this wave of modernisation and this opportunity that's ahead of us, look, it may happen next year, it may happen 5 years from now, but I feel very confident it will happen at some point. And to be involved in an industry that's evolving in that way in the space at this time is really fun and interesting. So for me, it's a great opportunity, serendipitous in many ways, and so far I've really been enjoying the journey and the very warm welcome that I've received from the team and from the industry. So yeah, so far it's great to be here.
And for the uninitiated, and I can't imagine there are that many, who Arken and what role do they play in the sector?
Well, thank you, David. So Arken.legal is a leading software platform that increases productivity and profitability for practitioners, minimizes risks, digitizes businesses, and hopefully will delight your customers. So this is a drafting tool primarily, but specifically for practitioners that will make their lives easier, faster, more productive with greater certainty. And, the feedback tends to be great, and I hopefully the listeners will enjoy it too.
Well, technology is obviously a very big part of today's discussion, so we'll no doubt come back to that. I mean, you couldn't really have chosen a more backward industry in many respects, given that primary legislation was enacted in 1837. It's a weird one, isn't it? Because we've got so much precedent that's kind of informed so much of our work over the course of the last 20, 30 years, and yet we're still driven by this century-old legislation. What do you kind of see that Arken brings to the table from a technology point of view with regard to what that modernisation might look like?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, because it is generally remarkable to consider a piece of legislation that governs such an important aspect of people's lives, inevitably, as they say, and taxes, and that it is literally unchanged. But, we live in a common law system, so the law can adapt. And for the most part, it works. And, one of the things I love about, that for me is particularly interesting to me about technology is the interface between technology and people. Mm-hmm. And here it couldn't be more meaningful. It is so personal. It is, arguably the most personal legal document, formal document anyone will complete. And, and it strikes at the heart of people's history, who they are, how they want to be remembered. I mean, it is the absolute bleeding edge of that interface between people and technology. So in that context, I appreciate that naturally there's a degree of conservatism, and certainly much more than I've seen in other sectors of law that I've worked in. But I get it, and I completely understand. And in that context, I would be shocked if 100 years from now, people aren't still completing paper wills more or less the same way they do today. Probably not many, but certainly some, for 1,000 good reasons. So I think that the role of technology is to recognize the traditions that are there for good reasons, especially the broader context of why they're given the immense personal importance of the topic. Support that, but then also support options for the future. So you asked the question, what's our role in this modernization? Look, ideally, as a practitioner, you can make a decision about whether you're going to produce a paper will that will be signed or witnessed with ink, or an electronic will that will be signed and witnessed digitally or electronically, and possibly remotely. We can talk about that as well. And to you as a practitioner, that process should be seamless and invisible. So that's where I see our role. Now, we don't know yet what an electronic will is. Believe me, we've got our best people working on it, and we're engaged with, anyone who'll talk to us, including the government, about how that should go and when that should go and what that should look like. But the end point should be, as a practitioner, all of that is taken off your plate, and all you know is that you're going to do your best to fulfill your client's intentions in a document, and whether that's an electronic document or a paper document should be seamless to you and made easy. What you'll need to do is understand the legal implications of those two different channels. But if we, on our side of the table, do our work well, that should all be seamless and transparent to you, the practitioner. At least that's the intention. That's the dream.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of be clear about your role as the enabler of the legislation, effectively, or any changes to legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's beautifully put. Exactly. So to make it as easy as possible for a practitioner to do their day job, and we take care of the heavy lifting, ideally with transparency, so you know what's happening inside the black box from a legal point of view, and that whatever the requirements for these electronic documents have been met. But for you, the practitioner, it should just be, toggling a switch on or off.
And of course, dealing with a lot of the pushback that the profession has raised, particularly around things like coercive control and some of the challenges that, to your point about remote witnessing, might present?
Yeah, so look, this is really interesting. Before, in preparation for today, I listened to the excellent interview you did with Nick Hopkins after the release of the Law Commission's report. And he made the point, which I think really strikes home to me, is that there's a distinction between the will document and the witnessing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I kind of followed up on that, and I'm going to publish more on this, but just a thought is, if you squint at Section 9 of the Wills Act today, you could enable an electronic will. It would need to be witnessed in person contemporaneously, but digitally, arguably you could press a button to signify your witnessing and put a digital signature. Plus, if you kind of look at it from a court's point of view, there's more evidence. You've got evidence of a timestamp, which you're not getting on a piece of paper. So, I think you can squint and make that case. What you can't do is make the case for remote witnessing. I think, in fairness, that was specifically rescinded after COVID. So that's the open question. And then I come back to the question is, look, as Nick Hopkins pointed out, if the base case is paper wills today, that says that we have to be at least as good as that, not necessarily better, ideally better, but not necessarily better, then, I think remote witnessing can be addressed relatively straightforward. The objections are pretty well understood. There was an excellent piece by a competitor of ours on today's Wills and Probate last year, talking about some of the risks. Look, I think they're pretty well understood, but I also think they can be well addressed. And what I've seen so far, and what I'm keen to kind of change, is people have been right in raising the concerns, and I take on board all the concerns that people have raised, but I haven't seen yet people saying, got it, okay, so that's a good description of the issue. Let's make a proposal on capital T, capital B, the best way to address it. And then let's, pick holes in that and see where we end up. So that's where I'm keen to kind of move the conversation.
I think one of the most important things that Nick said from my point of view was that we don't hold electronic out to be any better than
exactly
the paper version, that it's an alternative route. To your point, it's a toggle for the practitioner to decide, I'm going to do this one way or the other.
Yeah, and look, not to be a fanboy, but there's a lot that I applaud in the way the commission approached it. When I just looked at, just coming into this role and sort of trying to better understand the space. So, spending some looking at the US, Canada, Australia, and the way that they've looked to implement, somewhat, electronic wills, once again, means different things to different places. I really like the approach that we've taken here, where it's principle based, but leaves the specifics to regulation. In the US, there's a uniform code prepared by, I guess, their equivalent of the Law Commission. It's not direct analog. And I get where it's leaning to, but frankly, you can fulfill the remote witnessing requirement there, as I understand it, with video, which is fine, but it's not good enough. And I think the way it's been framed here is we can get into the detail and do something just a little bit better. Look, the advantage that I see is it should always be an option, but if we do our job really well, it should be a great option, dare I say, a better option. Because actually, on its face, a secure electronic will is better, objectively. There's more evidence than a paper will. But, there are those issues that you've raised.
So you joined the sector at a time of real change or potential change.
Yeah.
From a sector that was really developing, I suppose, from a technology point of view, if you were working in AI and augmentation. What were your first impressions once you landed within the sector then? Was it kind of what you expected? You talked about the fact that you've sort of looked at some of the other jurisdictions as well. I'm intrigued to know what an outsider coming in makes of wills and probate in England and Wales.
Great question. Look, I didn't really know what to expect. I did expect that it would be a close industry, because I sort of had a sense of it as a sector, how wills are positioned in the portfolio of service offerings from, lawyers and practitioners. So I had a sense of some of the dynamics. A few things struck me. One is how competitive it is commercially.
Right.
There are a lot of players, very crowded, very price competitive, very low margin across the board in, every, our part, the practitioner part, probate, no one is spared. But what surprises me in that context is how pleasant everybody is. and I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again. And my pet theory is it's the subject matter, and it comes back to that interface. It's so personal, and I just don't think someone without a genuinely good bedside manner, and by which, when I say genuine, is they actually have real empathy for their clients and, genuinely, doing their best, I don't think they'd be successful over time. So I think I think there's a high degree of self-selection. I can only speculate, but for whatever reason, I found people to be surprisingly pleasant and helpful, welcoming, facilitative in a really pleasing way. And so actually that's sort of, given that context of what I was sort of expecting, kind of, red and, tooth and claw capitalism, to find a very competitive industry being so pleasant is a delightful surprise.
What do you see in terms of consumer expectations of the market? Again, kind of leaning on some of your experience of working at mobile, all that kind of stuff. This is a very different sector, but customer expectations are changing because of the advances in technology elsewhere in life, aren't they?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think some of the preparation for electronic wills is getting ahead of the market. So, I mean, I just also noticed when I travel that the UK isn't as advanced as it used to be in digital infrastructure. So, already, the first contactless payment experience I had was overseas, probably 2 or 3 years before it was here. Already there's so much, WhatsApp business integration in a lot of other countries. It's to me, it feels, it's anecdotal, but it feels somewhat palpable that, there's an opportunity for us to catch up. So I see there's an opportunity here to develop the market. The reports from last year were showing, forgive me, I think, was it 41% of people are willed in the UK? Is it 43?
There are lots of different sort of stats out there, aren't there? Lies don't lie statistics, but around half to 2/3 of people don't have a will.
Exactly. Yeah, it's certainly in that order. And even for, in inverted commas, simple wills, people with comparatively straightforward estates, the benefits to having a will enormous. I think I feel validated in saying I feel the cause is just. I think it's a good thing that we build the market. But then coming back to, it's not a great analogy, but I guess coming back to your question, at Meta, I was working on virtual reality, for which, you can look around, there isn't a big market for today. So, part of the job is establishing and building that market, is education, building demand, showing use cases, all those sort of things. And I think that job lies ahead of us here as well. But this all comes back to my aspiration for electronic wills. I think it would be a passing grade for us to collectively, as an industry, pass legislation that enables electronic wills. Good-o. But I think this is an opportunity to kind of, what's the realm of the possible? And, the realm of the possible would be that we create something with such utility that's so obvious that we can tell the people about it, educate people about it, This is why it's secured. This is why it will make your lives better, assuming it's implemented in all the right ways, and create an uplift. I think mere implementation will show similar levels of uptake that we see in other jurisdictions, which is very, very, very small. They're outliers. But we're kind of missing the opportunity because all the and then what's that flow from having electronic wills, streamlining the probate process, and then our lives generally. Now, any number of implications, but managed well. And we're at a point now where in other jurisdictions, this sort of digital infrastructure has existed for, over a decade, in some cases two. And there are lots of examples that you can look to and, see where the potholes, try to avoid them, close to home. In Europe, plenty of countries have already seen the benefits. And I just think you've got to start somewhere. So I hope the aspiration is more than just implementation. I hope we aspire to help educate the public about the benefits, utility of having a will, and that the rising tide will lift all boats.
You recently published an industry response following a round table with professionals and other technology providers, and we've kind of covered some of the themes that I know kind of came out of those discussions. But what are professionals saying that we're missing from the reforms, or what are professionals saying that the reforms need to do? Because I love the point that you're making here about we can change the systems, we can change the processes, but unless we change hearts and minds, we're still going to be in the same position.
Yes. So in terms of what and I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think it's fair to say what we are unified around is the broad brushstrokes of the proposals. But I think part of the beauty, but then the challenge of the proposals is they are relatively broad brushstrokes. For example, what is a reliable system? We have some views. I've published a diagram. It's something I'm going to go expand on in the coming weeks and months. But these are things that we have to, I think, boil down to and then come up with a specific recommendation. I think the way forward is for us as an industry, and what I've tried to do, what I think we're trying to do in this group is bring together a group of leaders that some of whom are competitors, but with a broad view of the technology, the infrastructure, the legal side, and then hone in on various issues and come up with specific recommendations, very practical recommendations that the wider industry and government can say yes or no to, or that at least moves the conversation forward. I think it's too much to ask the government to come with a fully baked recommendation. So let's move it forward.
I want to dive into that, because the worry here, Anthony, is that if we don't lead this as a sector, we will be dictated to by the government, and that's not a position that we want to be in, because we're the experts, not them.
Yeah, I think that's right. But every communication I've seen from the government is that been very open to the consultation. The process has been very consultative. So I feel pretty confident that there's a listening ear. But yeah, I just also think it's incumbent on us to have a point of view. I mean, speaking selfishly, personally, I want to have a honed point of view, but frankly, I can't unless I know what the industry thinks. So, it helps me move the ball forward. But I think for any one part of the industry to kind of move forward alone does not make sense, because it's an ecosystem, and we collectively, I think, need to come up with proposals, or at least, at very worst, a point of view, and then we know how to push against anything coming from government. But I just think there are plenty of good questions that need to be addressed. What is a reliable system? What are the challenges with remote witnessing? I mean, we came very close in 2019 to taking a view on the reforms. Look, depending on the implementation, and this is where the recommendations are so important, depending on the implementation, remote witnessing could be many times more secure than the current system.
Yeah.
But it depends on what you're solving for. That has more hoops you have to jump through, makes it a little bit harder to adopt, a little bit harder to implement, has digital ID requirements. So there's more plumbing involved. You could just go with video conferencing, as many states. So I think that's why there isn't a right answer. They come with risks and benefits, and we collectively need to boil it down and come up with a view.
Listeners to today's Wills and Probate podcast will be aware we have sister podcasts. We have a Today's Conveyancer podcast, no prizes for guessing who that's targeted at. And the conveyancing industry has gone through a huge amount of digitization and modernization over the past 15 to 20 years. And one of the challenges it has seen is system interoperability. And what I mean by that, for the benefit of listeners, because I know as a technologist you'll appreciate this, is systems actually talking to one another. And there's been a huge amount of very siloed thinking in conveyancing that has actually led us to a position today where a typical transaction can take longer now than it did pre-technology. What are we doing as a sector, and what are you doing as a technology business to ensure that we are avoiding repeating those mistakes?
Yeah, it's interesting you should raise that, because it's something that I've noticed is, I guess I'm more familiar with workplace IT, where everything has an API. It's super well documented. The SDKs have been published for the last 10 years. They're large developer communities built around that specific API. It's so I mean, I've seen the nth degree. This clearly isn't that. And I've been wondering why. My assumption is also that, and I think it's also something to do with the nature of the work in the sector, is that digitalization has come comparatively late relative to other sectors, and it's now just catching up. But it's a legacy that I observe in wills and probate as well. I see opportunities for our growth in that space as well, as does the team, and that's something we'll be looking at very keenly. But it's certainly something I perceive. I'm presuming it's legacy. It's a question that I'm also
still mulling over. I think there's a lot of work to be done. Again, to going back to thinking about government, one of the challenges that we've had in conveyancing is that we've needed HMLR land registry to digitize, because they're the arbiter. They hold the information. They hold the key to a lot of this. And in the same way, although we don't have sort of central will banks, we've got the probate registry has had to do what it needs to do in order to enable us to be better as well, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah, 1000%. Look, I mean, there are different approaches to digitizing this part of government, and you could take a holistic view if we want to have like an operating system for government. Yeah, I guess somewhat in the way India does, and apparently very successfully. I mean, it's and as I said, they're kind of selling the operating system around the world now, and more power to them. Or you could take an approach where you kind of find a point solution that has all the logical and then what's. Just given that this isn't apparently high on the list of priorities today, and just given everything else going on in the world and the country, I can't see that will be. My preference would be to start with a point solution that then prompts all the next obvious questions. So if you have an electronic will, that sounds like a really great opportunity to integrate with the probate system. And then maybe with land registry, and look what's happening here. So my preference at this point would be take the first step, do it with the longer view, so that all the further steps you want to take are still possible and logical, but just move forward with a solution that makes sense in and of itself, but then has all these beautiful options that flow from it.
It's been a bit of a meander around modernisation, technology, incorporating your views on where the industry's going and what we need to be thinking about in 2026 ultimately. So I'm very appreciative of your time, Anthony. I have one final question, and I'm not sure whether you'll appreciate me asking you this, but
Mm.
you've been in post now for what, about 9 months?
Yeah, exactly. About 9 months.
And I wonder if you might share with us what you know now that you wished you might have known when you took the role. But I won't ask you whether that would have impacted your decision to join or not.
Great question. Look, there are things about our business that if I'd known or understood earlier, I could have done things sooner, could have, should have. It comes back to the point we're discussing before. I guess I understood. I had a look. Came to your publications. I went to LinkedIn, did a bit of research beforehand, and tried to understand, just internalize the dynamics of the industry. I really didn't anticipate how competitive it is. Unusually, in my experience, usually, I've been working in industries where they're a relatively small handful of larger competitors and a few upstarts. This is, and it varies by incredibly the complexity. And had I understood that early, it just would have sped everything up for me. It took me a good 6 months to really, actually, it's probably even the BWACs and actually, putting faces to names and really sort of meeting people and understanding it. That actually is really, really kind of settled in for me. And look, and I love that, and I really enjoy it because it actually just makes it more interesting. But I'd love to have known that earlier.
It's hugely interrelational, and I mean, I speak about that from the point of view of the whole of legal services. Actually, as I say, we're a publisher of specifically 3 areas of the law: conveyancing, wills, probate, and family. And you can see even within each of those sort of micro communities, there is a huge amount of interrelationships that, as you say, if you'd known about earlier, you probably would have been able to take advantage of as well. So no, I get that completely. Antti, we're out of time. I mean, it's been fab to have you on the podcast. I hope listeners have got a bit more of a flavour of who you are, the organisation that you're leading as well. So thank you so much for joining.
David, a pleasure, and it was fun being here. Great chatting as always.
The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Anthony. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.